I'm Deborah Hickok of Featherstone Personal and Professional Coaching, and today I'm going to be talking to you about something that I consider to be a real cornerstone of mindful leadership and really mindfulness in general. I'm going to be discussing something called dealing with the data. And what this really is it's about staying connected to the truth of what's happening, being with what is, as opposed to taking yourself into thoughts about what isn't. I'll be discussing this in three different ways: the importance of staying with the facts, how we leave the data and go somewhere else, and what happens when we do that, and then offering some tools for keeping connected to the facts and the truth of a situation. One thing I'd like to say about leadership in general, though, is whether you're watching this and you have an official leadership title or a professional role that puts you in a leadership capacity in some official way, just remember that so many of our day-to-day encounters, so many of our opportunities in our life each day are that of potential leadership. The ability to lead others, to model behavior, and to interact from a place of our inner leadership skills, even if we're leading in a very quiet way. So what's important about staying with the facts, about being connected to the data and the data only? What happens when we do this, and what happens when we don't? When we are not connected to the facts because we have been hijacked by compulsive thinking about something that isn't really related to the current moment, we lose access to some important aspects of the situation and important aspects of ourselves. What we lose in the situation is the ability to pick up on sometimes nuanced information, very subtle but relevant facts that we want to have as a part of whatever decision we make or whatever response we have. We also could even overlook very obvious information or relevant facts when we start to detach from the situation or the other person because of a place that we're going in our own mind. What we lose access to within ourselves when we don't stay connected to the data is that we get on a very slippery slope where we can begin to assign personal meaning to something or project something that is not actually true onto a situation, a circumstance, or another person. And when we do that, we have gone up into our heads. We're not connected to our entire being in that moment. And this is what we no longer have open access to. We lose touch in these moments with our intuition. We lose touch with the deep wisdom that lives inside of us. We lose touch with our bodies often, and our bodies have a lot of innate intelligence that can offer us information around what we may be perceiving or connecting to that's in the circumstance. Another thing that thinking shuts down when we do it outside the present moment, when we spend time thinking about something other than the data, is that it shuts down our creativity. So much of deep and robust creativity and creative insight pops in from places that are not about our thinking mind. We don't tend to give birth to really creative processes from thinking alone. So we can close down access to this energy that lives in us when we're not able to just stay with the data, which leaves room for access to all of the things I've just mentioned. I'd like to now review with you the way in which we leave the present moment. I say review because I have talked about this, and I know some of you are familiar with these two models that I'm going to be talking about. And I just want to say that even if it is a review for you, I find that on my own mindfulness path, I am constantly listening to my teachers talk about the same kind of message or process or practice over and over because I really want it to be deepened and anchored, and I also want to be reminded. So although I'm going to visit a couple of aspects of how we leave the present moment and lose touch with the data, and it is a review for you, I hope you'll still find it helpful. So there was a researcher, his name was Paul Ekman, and he discovered something that he called auto-appraisers that are mechanisms in our brain. Auto as in automatically, appraisers as in appraising a situation, automatically appraising a situation. And what he discovered was that when we're having an encounter or we're in some kind of a situation, anything about that situation that may even be slightly reminiscent of an old experience that we've had previously, often in our childhood, will cause us to immediately plug right back in to the emotion that we had back when we had the original experience. So there might be just a tone of voice or even a look someone gives you, and their intention is not at all related to the place where you go emotionally. In other words, this is a database that creates a shortcut right back to old emotions, old responses that are related to an earlier time in our life, but they come up and get expressed in live time if we don't learn how to interrupt this pattern and rewire this kind of a response. The model that I want to point out to you about the way in which we leave the facts and get into a place that is compromising the facts and hence compromising our leadership was developed by Chris Argyris, and I know many of you have heard of this already. It's called the ladder of inference. This is something that is now used in organizations around the world, and it's an opportunity to help people understand how we no longer deal with the data and how we often do end up compromising or interpreting factual information, which again prevents us from leading really well. The ladder of inference is a process that we engage in, and I'm going to take you up the ladder as a review very quickly for our purposes here. A situation unfolds, something is happening. We connect with the data and we are now up one rung of the ladder. We don't typically connect with all data. We connect with the most resonant data and often will leave some of the data out. Once we connect with the resonant data, we climb up to the next rung of the ladder and we put some kind of personal meaning on it. We already have a belief system that we've developed from our earlier life and our childhood and so forth, and we end up having some kind of an emotional reaction, and we put a personal assignment on this data that's coming from our history. We're now up on another rung of the ladder. Based on the meaning that we assign to the data that we have taken in, we then draw a conclusion. Now we're on another rung of the ladder. Based on this conclusion, which is already been interpreted and isn't completely clean, we then get to the top of the ladder and we take action. We are acting based on a conclusion we drew, based on a personal interpretation of the data, and at that point the data became compromised. It was no longer clean and factual because it has gone through a personal filter of ours. Many, many people are operating much of the time, even in leadership, at the top of the ladder. And if we stick with this metaphor that Chris Argyris developed, we know that if we're going to operate from the top of a ladder, we are not well supported. It's shaky at the top of a ladder. And imagine what you're missing when you're not grounded, literally down on the ground, not close to the data, not coming face to face with it, but up on a ladder, which is not the most solid form of support for leadership. So what does it mean when we leave this factual ground and we climb up to the ladder and we start operating from there? Well, there are many mindfulness teachers that refer to this as we are now in our story. We are no longer in fact, but we have started to write a new story about the situation. And, well, let's visit storytelling for a minute. I actually am a big fan of good storytelling. I really love a good story, and I love a person who can tell one well. There's a place for storytelling in our culture, in our society, in our life, but not when it comes to mindfulness, not when it comes to interactions that need to be meaningful and truth-based. So I imagine that if you think about it for a minute, you can all come up with someone you know who does what we call leads with their story. This is when a person becomes so merged with their story, so identified with it, that they lose touch with the inner essence of who they really are, the deep wisdom of their being, their creativity, their intuition, their body intelligence, and they become their story. They lead with it, they're very identified with it, they are what happened to them. Well, this is an example of being so deeply merged with your story that you're really losing touch with the truth and with the facts. So let's look at some tools for how to climb down off the ladder, and stay in more of a fact-based leadership role. One of the first things that we can do when we've left the present moment is learn to become aware that that's what we're doing. And of course, doing this is just as challenging as integrating any new habit that feels really important to us into our life. And interrupting the old habit and replacing it with a new one is just as straightforward here as in other ways. For example, when you cut up the fresh carrots and make sure they're available to you so that you won't reach for the potato chips, or you have to physically set an alarm that will wake you earlier than you normally get up, or you won't allot time for the morning meditation or exercise, you're using a physical structure to integrate a new and important habit. It's really no different here. What a lot of my clients do is they use a physical structure that we then assign a very deliberate association with this question: am I starting to climb up the ladder and assign personal meaning to a situation instead of staying with the facts? It could be anything at all that resonates for you, whether it's your screensaver, a rock or a beautiful shell on your desk, something you draw or write, a photo, even a special piece of jewelry. Some of my male clients put a stone or a coin in their pocket, and whenever you encounter it or come in contact with it, you begin to develop the immediate association to the question: am I starting to go up the ladder? Am I starting to leave the facts and assign some personal meaning to them? So let's run this through an example. Let's say that you're giving a presentation and someone who is listening to the presentation checks their phone maybe a couple of times, and you're off and running. What are some of the things you might say to yourself as someone is checking their phone during your presentation? You might say, he doesn't think I'm worthy of being up here. He's bored. My presentation is too long. It could be anything like that, and we could really go on and on. But what is the truth here? The real truth? It's that we have no idea what the reason is this person is checking his phone. We can't really know. And it could be any number of reasons that could go on forever. It could be anything from someone he loves just got out of surgery and promised to let him know that it went well, to just something as simple as a very compulsive habit to check his phone frequently, and he's not aware that this is what he does. The bottom line, though, is if it were not for your history, your own data bank, the auto appraisers I've just mentioned, and the climbing of the ladder, you would not assign this kind of meaning to that gesture. And when we assign that kind of meaning in a situation like this, we are already distancing ourselves from the task at hand. You are already, even if it's in a very subtle way that you're not very aware of, starting to drain some of the energy off of your presentation and into the little story that has begun to develop as you have assigned meaning to this person and what they've done by checking their phone during your presentation. And we want to have all of our energy and all of our presence available to us to give the very best presentation that we can. One of the things that's important to remember about this is that we only can assign personal meaning to something if it's being pulled out of our history. This is where our ego lives. It only lives in our own historic database, like the auto appraisers that Paul Ekman says. And when we climb the ladder, what we're hauling up with us is our history. That's what happens when we're no longer in the present moment and meeting each situation in and of itself. So, for example, there's a great illustration of how this works in a true story that I heard Jack Kornfield tell when he talked about being with the Dalai Lama at a meeting, a mindfulness summit of sorts, 25 or 30 years ago. A number of mindfulness teachers, along with the Dalai Lama, were meeting with a group of students, and they were talking about mindfulness. And one of the students asked the Dalai Lama a question. He wanted to know, how do you deal with moments of self-hatred or a general feeling that you just don't like yourself? And the Dalai Lama didn't understand the question. Well, after working with his Tibetan interpreter and some of the other mindfulness teachers explaining what the student meant, what became clear to everyone, including the Dalai Lama, was that this wasn't a language barrier. This was something that wasn't in the Dalai Lama's database. It just didn't exist for him. So there was no way he could pull it out and understand it. For example, if the day that you gave the presentation, you came from another planet and the spaceship dropped you off to go into the room and start talking, and you didn't know what cell phones were, I bet a lot of people in the audience could have checked their phones and you probably wouldn't have missed a beat because it wasn't a part of your history to associate someone looking away from you while you're talking or checking a phone while you're speaking with maybe another time in your life where for you, you feel that that's being dismissive or disrespectful or some indictment of your self-worth. Again, we can't know that that has anything to do with the gesture of checking the phone. And if you dropped in from another planet with no personal history, you wouldn't have thought so either. So it's all about our history. And again, the first tool that I've just mentioned, put a structure in place in your life to just begin to ask yourself, am I actually moving into a place of not really knowing that what I'm telling myself is true at all? There's another tool, tool number 2, and this is kind of a dual tool, if you will, and that is breath and conscious pausing. So breath continues to be the number one user-friendly, convenient, at your fingertips tool that actually has an incredible amount of power. We really aren't able to stay in compulsive thought if we're deeply, rhythmically, consciously taking breath in and letting it out. So it's a way for us to start to come down the ladder and get grounded back in the facts. Conscious pausing is another action or inaction we can take along with slowing everything down, the run up the ladder, by taking some deep breaths when we're in a situation and our structure has helped us to realize, ooh, I've started to put some personal meaning on a situation and I can't really know. So conscious pausing is actually an act of great empowerment. I actually refer to pausing as a very empowered boundary. It's something that I don't really think we're that comfortable with in this society, and I don't think we're that comfortable with pausing in our work culture. Pausing actually is a gift that we can give ourselves and others. Not only does it allow us to come down off the ladder, and sometimes just a conscious pause gets another person to come down a rung or two also, but it gives us an opportunity to survey the circumstance and make sure we really are plugged into the facts. And that is when we are able to lead most powerfully. One of the things I discovered as a parent, and I believe that parenting is absolutely a form of leadership, is that I could pause when my children approached me and I was in various circumstances with them. I used to think that I had to come up with a very motherly, sound answer to it all each time my kids approached me. And I believed when I learned mindfulness that this was a way that I managed my own anxiety sometimes as a mother. I've got to come across like I have it all together and I have an immediate answer for my kids. And it was so great to start pausing and to model that for them. So for example, if something happened and I knew one of my kids needed to have a consequence, but I just wasn't exactly sure what the right one was, or if they asked permission to go do something when they were teenagers and I wasn't yet sure because maybe it was the first time they'd asked for that particular event to attend, or if they just asked me an important question, something they really cared about, I learned to pause if I needed to. I learned to say, I'm not sure. I have to think about this. I'm going to get back to you. And often what I was doing, particularly in regard to a consequence that might be really appropriate for a situation, or whether I wanted to give them permission to do something, was I would have to collect a little data first, get back to dealing with the data. So pausing is an empowered boundary, and it's important that we give ourselves permission to do that from time to time, or actually regularly. That's even better. The third tool that we can bring so that we stay connected to the data and we don't compromise it, which always compromises our leadership, is the ever important tool that is so foundational to good leadership, and that is to be sure to inquire, to be sure to ask yourself or others about your story, about something that may be a presumption, to kind of poke holes in it, if you will. And we do this both internally and externally. So let's have a look at the internal process first. And often when we do that successfully, we don't end up needing to go outside and check out our story externally, although there's often very appropriate times to do that. I like to go with 2 questions from Byron Katie. They're very effective to check out my own story. And they are, first, can I actually know absolutely, with complete certainty, that what I am telling myself right now about this person or this situation is absolutely true? Can I know for sure? Sometimes the answer is yes, and often it's no. And then we go to the next question. When I decide that it's true, when I attach myself to this belief I have, what happens? How do I treat myself? What do I think inside? Where does my energy and attention go? How do I treat the other person or persons? What happens in this situation? So when we make a decision that something that we have interpreted is actually true, and if you ask yourself this question, you'll often find, yeah, this is an interpretation. I can't know unequivocally that this is a fact. And then you'll begin to let go of it and know, I'm not dealing in the fact when I do this. Even if you do find that the question is true, and sometimes it is, I've checked it out with myself, and I actually have enough information to know that it's true. Then in question number 2, you want to have a look at where you're putting your focus. Keep it on the data. If any part of what you're looking at and what you've decided is true, if any part of it is you doing a little interpreting, then you are compromising yourself and the other person. But if you return to the data, then you can go to question 2 and say, okay, how do I want to behave? How am I behaving? But make sure that it's data-based and nothing else. Then we have situations where we actually want to go for outside validation or invalidation, depending on the case. And this is really important also. In fact, Chris Argyris used to say, the minute something is self-evident, you're on a slippery slope. Well, what does he mean by that? If it's self-evident, how can I be on a slippery slope? We're on a slippery slope because self-evidence leads us to often not check it out. Well, if it's evident to me, isn't it evident to everybody else? Well, there's the assumption. So self-evidence is actually a good red flag to check it out and make sure that what's clear to you is clear to other people also. In fact, in my private practice, I work with so many clients, and it's really interesting to look at how there will be a relationship that will have been going on for many years. It could be a work relationship or a personal relationship. And my client will say to me, well, this person should know this about me by now. They should know I'd like to do it this way, for example. And I will ask, have you ever told them how important this is to you? Have you ever asked that this be addressed? Clearly, specifically. And they say, well, no. So there is this way that we start to make an assumption. We're not in the data anymore. You've never conveyed it, but you're allowing all the miles you've logged in with this person to have a meaning that isn't about a fact. They ought to know. The fact is they don't. The fact is you haven't asked or told them for what you need. So this is where checking it out is actually very important. What happens when we don't check things out sometimes or give expression to something that we need based on the facts alone is that what gets compromised is really important aspects of really good leadership: collaboration, cooperation, inclusion, and not being in that beginner's mind where we stay open to the possibility of a new and interesting and creative outcome because we make room for all the facts and all of the input. Remember, when we decide that what we are thinking about something is the correct approach, we've just shut down possibility for creative new pathways and new ideas. And one thing that we know from the data about leadership is that one of the hallmarks of good leadership is making sure that you check with other people, make sure you're on the same page about what you're thinking, what you're assuming, what kind of meaning you're giving the data. When people are checked in with about this kind of thing, what the data shows, the studies, is that they are much more likely to cooperate, to feel included, and to actually be invested in the outcome. So this is why it's important to remember to check out something if you're not sure. We know that a big part of leadership and leading well and staying with only the data has to do with, excuse me, unhooking from our history. We've already talked about how when we go up the ladder and our auto appraisers start activating all over the place, we're coming from our history. When you think you know why someone checked their phone in your presence, you're coming from your history. And we need to unhook from our history. That's what brings us into the present moment. Richard Moss calls this being in a storyless state. He's a physician and very well-known mindfulness teacher. His focus is mindfulness and the role it plays in wellness in our body. But he teaches mindfulness all over the world. And he often asks, what is it like to come to this interaction with no story whatsoever, as if you don't have any memory? And this is where we're also unhooking from the other person's history as well. And this is really important. So for example, let's say that someone has, for quite a while now, not been answering your emails in a timely way, and it's starting to have an effect. It's affecting some project deadlines, or maybe morale, or maybe communication among the team. Well, you may be aware of this person's history, but if that's what you focus on, they have a history of doing this, and you do it in anything other than a fact-based way, you are now spending your energy being offended, being self-righteous, being weary and impatient and tired of this situation. And there is not one aspect of that energy and that mindset that is going to serve you in a leadership role. You can use the 6 months of delayed response as your data. What is delayed response? How many days does it take this person to get back to you? How long has that been happening? And then we go in and we do what we need to do. We ask for what we need. We find out what's needed to have a new agreement around turnaround time when it comes to emails. But we leave out the drama, and we leave out what it has evoked for us that is personal, because that is coming from our history. The other important aspect of not getting hooked into another person's history is that when we do that, especially as a leader, we are no longer seeing that person in their potential. We've put them inside the story box and we've closed the lid. We don't want to see a very complex human being with their own history, their own background, their own personal situations that we're not aware of, and a completely potential path in front of them, and shut the lid on that because we are making them what they've done. It's not humane. It's not leading with integrity. It's not appropriate, and it's not dealing with the current facts. So Byron Katie gives a really good example of how we stay out of our personal stuff and yet change a situation based on the data. Now, this is an interpersonal example, but I think it's such a great one that I love to share it. And it really shows how this works. She tells the story of meeting a friend for dinner because they were going to be catching up with one another. And she got to the restaurant and the friend never showed up. So she had dinner and they rescheduled. And the friend didn't show up the second time either. So I just want you to pause for a second. I want you to think about where you could go with a friend not showing up at the restaurant to meet you for dinner, not once, but twice. I think there's a lot of places we could go with that when someone doesn't come 2 times in a row. What kind of friend is this? I've wasted my time. Maybe they're not being respectful of my time, and on, we're off and running. This is what Katie did. She got in touch with her friend and she said, I really like you and I really like catching up with you. It's really fun to do that. I'm not going to meet you at a restaurant anymore though. I went 2 times and you didn't come, and I would have rather not gone out that night and eaten by myself in a restaurant. So let's talk on the phone from now on, and I really look forward to the next time that we do. She preserved a friendship without fanfare, without drama, and without deciding that it was a personal affront to her. But she took care of herself. She was empowered to stay in the data with no drama. And I think it's just a really great example. We have to be careful of what we're bringing to the party. There was a man, his name was Stuart Brand, And he was a very successful guy. He was a writer, and he founded something called the Whole Earth Catalog. And he had a saying. It was one statement that he used to make every day. He said, "Every day I ask myself, what is it that I may be dead wrong about today? How many things might I just be dead wrong about?" And here's the thing about that. When we're wrong about something, we don't have to collapse it into meaning anything else. It doesn't mean you're not good at your job. It doesn't mean you're not worthy. It means that you're wrong sometimes. We all are. That's all. So we're unhooking from history, and let's get back to that a little bit, because this is where the power lies, staying in the current circumstance. I want to make sure I explain that I'm not talking about, well, what do we do? Just keep everybody at work because we're hoping that they live into their potential? That's not what I mean. But what I do mean is we don't fully identify a whole human being with what they've done, even if it's a mistake that's gone on for a long time. I worked with a client. She's the president of a company, and she experienced a very significant betrayal by a longtime employee. When she got out of her story, when we worked together and she left her personal history behind, and she met that employee right where he was to let him go, she did fire him. But it was done with such elegance, such grace, and in such a humane way. She took care of herself and she protected her company. She did exactly what she needed to do, but she did it with no personal assignation. She did it without rolling backward to something that happened before and deciding that this was personal to her, because it isn't. It's not personal, ever, if you stay with the facts. In fact, Eckhart Tolle talks about something that I think is very powerful. He says that when you judge a whole complex human being, and you decide that they are this one act, that they are this one pattern of their behavior, and you slap a judgment on them, you've just engaged at the first level of abuse of another person. And he gives an interesting example. He says, let's say that someone lies to you. They actually lie every day. Maybe they've been lying for a while, several times a day. You can stay with the facts. This is a person who lied to me on this occasion, and this occasion, and this occasion, and I am going to do something about it. I have to. Or you can say, he's a liar. Well, you've just put him in the box. You've made all of who he is come under the heading of one word, a pejorative word that has to do with some mistakes that he's definitely making. And I thought the difference was really powerful. We're perpetuating something that is not clean, not out of our integrity as a leader when we do that. But oh, what integrity and power we're in when we stay with the data. We don't have to keep a person like that around, but imagine what you're modeling to everyone around you when you just deal with the data. Imagine the grace that that allows in. That's what happened with my client when she was betrayed by an employee. Grace and elegance, cleanliness, integrity, power, and it's all data-based. So we unhook from our history and we lead in a powerful and humane way. I hope you'll remember to review these tools. Find a structure to help you realize you're running up the ladder. Be kind with yourself about that and come back down. Be sure to take some breaths and give yourself permission to take the time you need to get yourself back on the ground and get the data collected. Inquire inside your own mind and then outside on a practical level if needed. Make any change you need to make, absolutely. Protect yourself, your job, your employees, your company. Protect your family, your loved ones. But stay with the data, and then we're leading really well. Thank you for listening. I'm Deborah Hickok. Take care.